When John Steinbeck wrote East of Eden in 1952, he wrote it by hand. It's said that he used over 300 pencils. Now, here I come 70 years later, and it takes me over 25 hours to listen to it on audiobook. So was it worth it? Hi everyone, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop shop for all things audiobook. Now, John Steinbeck wrote East of Eden in 1952. It was about 2/3 of the way through his career, but there's a really great quote I'd like to read to you about what John Steinbeck said about this book. I think everything else I have written, in a sense, has been practice for this. Now that says a lot when an author who's written blockbusters and won a Nobel Prize, books such as Grapes of Wrath or Pearl or Of Mice and Men, I mean, oh my God, there are so many of them. When he thinks that everything he's written prior was practice for this book, that really tells you a lot about the stock he put in his own story. And a lot of people say that this is his magnum opus. And I haven't read all his books. In fact, I've only read a couple of his books, and I read Grapes of Wrath, probably when I was way too young to understand it. And I read Of Mice and Men, but I don't really remember the book. I remember the movie, because I remember that Lenny keeps asking George when we're going to get the rabbits. And I remember that I had a weird crush on Gary Sinise. But I haven't really read a lot of John Steinbeck. So this book kept popping up for me, and I decided to take some time and give it a try. Now, I was a little intimidated by the 25 hours at first, but the truth is, once I got into it, it was great. Now, when I'm not getting into a book because I find I'm not paying attention, I will often restart an audiobook. And I did restart this book twice before it grabbed me. But it wasn't the book, it was me. I wasn't really finding a connection because I was doing other things and I was half paying attention. So when I actually paused and I took a moment to clear my head and I started the book again, I found wow. I got into it really quickly. He is a master of description, and he's a master of painting a scene. And the minute I noticed that, and that if I was listening, I would get a really strong visual image, I found this book absolutely captivating. In East of Eden, we effectively follow two families, the Trask family and the Hamilton family. Now, they live on neighboring farms in the Salinas Valley in California, which is where Steinbeck sets most of his books. So to say that this book is just the simple interactions between the two families is really the understatement of the century. However, not a lot happens. Not a lot of big action anyway, but every heartache, every fight, every conflict, every financial problem, everything that they experience in their lives, war, automobiles, all kinds of things, they all happen in this book. So it's not a big action story. It's really a very realistic fiction story, which truthfully is my favorite genre at this point, or at least I think it is. I'm leaning that way. But this story follows these two families through many, many years, and you watch characters grow up and you watch other characters age, and it's really incredibly moving. I will tell you, and this is something that you'll see anywhere that you Google this book, so it's not a spoiler, it's just kind of common information. But there are hints in the story of Adam and Eve. There are hints of Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel. There are lots of things that are nods to bigger stories that we know in our world, but the way that Steinbeck does them, it just pulls you in. He grabs you with every little itty-bitty piece of information that he puts there. And there were a lot of times when I was reading this book that things would come up. And I would think to myself, because sometimes this is how I think as a reader, why is that there? That feels like an odd detail. And now we're on this tangent where I feel like, wow, I'm not sure if that's going to come back. I'll say this about Steinbeck. Every single word is placed with a purpose. So there were things that were not necessarily going to turn into big events later in the book, and they were important, but there were also things that I really just didn't think anything of that became monumental. So I will say, without spoiling anything, that this book had an effective enough setup that I on a number of occasions was punched in the gut by a single word. So that's very powerful when you're an author who can do that, where you can make your language be so meaningful to a reader. And Steinbeck absolutely nails that. So the book came out in 1952, but a lot of the story could take place anywhere, anytime. It's set in the 20s and the 30s and 40s, and you know that based on some of the information about the things that are happening in the world. For example, the onset of the popularity of the automobile. We know we're in the 20s and 30s. The draft in World War II. We know we're in the early 40s. So there are a lot of moments that sort of mark you in time in this book, but the story feels timeless. And it actually became timeless as I was reading it, in that I stopped paying attention to time. A 25-hour audiobook is a large undertaking. But I started staying up late. I started getting out of bed later. I started missing things. I was actually almost late to an appointment on the day that I finished it. It just really kept pulling me. And I found myself, this is when I know a book is really good. I found myself abandoning the things that I was doing while I listened and just listening. Richard Poe, the narrator, is phenomenal. He has a very classic male voice. He can do a young male all the way up to a seasoned, gravelly, older male. And while he didn't outright attempt to do separate voices for everyone, he had a very clear cadence for each of the characters in the book. And you know, when you have a narrator who can make you feel like you're listening to different people without even really trying, it's not like he's doing impressions or anything, that really speaks well to how he narrates the book. I wonder in this book if this narrator actually is a similar voice to that of John Steinbeck, who I've never heard a recording of, but John Steinbeck, incidentally, is the narrator character in the book. It's a very subtle piece of the book, and he introduces himself through some sort of memories that come up, but he is actually the character that is narrating the book. So it's like the author telling the story himself, but Richard Poe just represents his language so well. His pacing is phenomenal. The way that he pauses and creates emphasis, the way that he brings emotion out in his voice, absolute 5-star narrator. And you know, he's someone who you could listen to at first and think, well, this is ordinary. He was anything but ordinary. This book was anything but ordinary. I am so glad that this popped up for me. It's something that just kept appearing on my radar. It's obviously not a new book, but I found that I was noticing it in places. And to me, when that happens, that means it's time to read that book. So I decided I was going to take it on. And again, 25 hours, that's a pretty big task, but it went by really quickly and I loved every second of it. It's probably sitting on your library shelf right now, so go borrow it. Even better, download it digitally, because you can listen to Richard Poe's magical voice tell you John Steinbeck's magical words, and you can immerse yourself in the world of East of Eden. Highly recommended. But remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion. But thanks for listening to mine. See you next time.